The blizzard howled across the frozen plains of Cygnus X-2, sending shards of ice clattering against the reinforced dome of the abandoned research station. Kalen winced as a particularly vicious gust made the transparent panels groan in protest. The structural integrity readings on his wrist monitor flashed amber again. That section of the dome had been weakening for months, and now the latest storm was threatening to breach it entirely. "Just hold together a little longer," he muttered, grabbing his repair kit and thermal suit. As the airlock hissed, closed behind him, Kalen felt the familiar weight of isolation settle over him. 3 years he'd been here, alone with the ghosts of his past and the relentless, punishing cold. 3 years since the Helix 7 disaster that had cost 42 lives, a catastrophe his technology had failed to prevent. 3 years of exile, self-imposed, but no less crushing. The wind hit him like a physical blow when he stepped outside, nearly sweeping his feet from under him. Snow crystals stung any exposed skin as he made his way to the dome's maintenance ladder, the storm attempting to pry him from the rungs with each step upward. The temperature reading on his helmet display showed -78°C, not accounting for wind chill. Just another pleasant day on Cygnus X-2. Working quickly with gloved hands, Kalen applied the thermal sealant to the hairline fracture that threatened the dome's integrity. The material would harden completely in about 20 minutes, but it would hold for now. As he began his descent, his scanner beeped unexpectedly, a sound he hadn't heard in months. The long-range biosensor had detected something, a life sign, faint and fluctuating approximately 3 kilometers to the east. Kalen froze on the ladder. Nothing lived on the surface of Cygnus X-2. The research station had been built here precisely because the planet was considered sterile, perfect for controlled experiments. The only indigenous life forms were extremophile bacteria in the deepest thermal vents, and those were nowhere near his location. You should ignore it. The reading was probably an equipment malfunction, the cold playing havoc with ancient circuitry. He had enough problems keeping himself alive without chasing sensor ghosts. But something made him pause. The pattern of the biosignature was oddly familiar, complex, multicellular, warm-blooded, and it was fading. "Damn it," he whispered, the words immediately crystallizing in the air before him. Before he could rationalize himself out of it, Kalen was reprogramming his transport sled's navigation system. The journey through the storm was treacherous. Twice the sled nearly tipped over in sudden wind gusts, and once Kalen lost visibility entirely, forced to navigate solely by instrument readings. The life sign grew weaker with each passing minute, spurring him to push the sled's engines beyond safety parameters. He found it at the edge of the ancient chasm, a kilometers-deep crevasse that scientists believed had once been a liquid water channel eons ago. Half buried in blue-white snow and ice was a small escape pod, its design unlike anything Kalen had seen before. No known human vessels used that configuration, and the alloys looked strange even through his snow-crusted visor. "Hello," he called out, though he knew the wind would swallow his voice. "Anyone alive in there?" Approaching cautiously, he brushed away accumulated snow for what appeared to be a view screen. The interior was dark, but his helmet light revealed movement within. Someone was inside, huddled against the far wall of the tiny craft. It took nearly 15 minutes to figure out the unfamiliar emergency release mechanism. When the hatch finally slid open with a hydraulic hiss, Kalen's light illuminated an interior barely 2 meters across, life support systems blinking critical warnings in an unknown script. And there she was. Not human. That was clear immediately. Her skin was a pale lavender hue, with delicate, almost translucent scaling along her temples and the backs of her hands. Where human hair would be, she had fine, feather-like appendages that shifted from deep purple at the roots to silver at the tips. But her eyes, large, almond-shaped, and startlingly silver, were what struck Kalen most. They held intelligence, fear, and unmistakable pain. She was curled protectively around her swollen abdomen, and Kalen didn't need his medical training to recognize the rhythmic contractions racking her body. The alien woman was in labor. Blood, darker than human blood, more indigo than red, seeped from a wound on her shoulder. Her breathing came in quick, shallow gasps, each exhale releasing a wisp of condensation in the rapidly cooling air of the pod. The life support was failing. In another hour, maybe less, the temperature inside would be as deadly as the frozen wasteland outside. For a heartbeat, Kalen hesitated. His supplies were limited. The station barely maintained enough resources for one person. Taking her back meant risking his own survival, potentially for nothing if he couldn't save her. She was an unknown species with unknown biology. What if she carried pathogens dangerous to humans? What if helping her triggered some interstellar conflict he knew nothing about? Then she gasped again, one hand reaching out instinctively before falling back. The gesture was so fundamentally familiar, so universal in its desperate plea, that something broke inside him. 3 years ago, he had watched through a viewport as the Helix 7 reactor containment failed, unable to save those trapped inside despite having designed the safety systems himself. He had run then, hidden away on this frozen rock rather than face what he'd done. He wouldn't run now. "I'm going to help you," he said, knowing she couldn't understand him, but hoping his tone conveyed his intentions. "I need to move you, and it's going to hurt, but I'll be as careful as I can." Her silver eyes widened as he reached for her, but she was too weak to resist as he lifted her from the pod. She weighed less than he expected, despite her pregnancy, and her skin was cool to the touch, cooler than a human's would be. He wrapped her in his emergency thermal blanket before securing her to the transport sled. "Hold on," he told her, setting the sled's engines to maximum output. "Just hold on." The journey back to the research station passed in a blur of wide-out conditions and mechanical protests from the overtaxed sled. By the time they reached the airlock, the alien woman's breathing had become erratic, her contractions closer together. Kalen carried her directly to his makeshift medical bay, once the station's primary research lab. Obsolete equipment lined the walls, most of it repurposed for his survival rather than research. He'd maintained basic medical capabilities. Living alone on a hostile planet made that a necessity, but nothing designed for obstetrics, certainly nothing calibrated for non-human physiology. He laid her gently on the examination table, noting how the room's warmth seemed to ease some of her distress. Working quickly, he sanitized his hands and gathered what supplies he could: analgesics, antiseptics, wound sealant, thermal regulators. The alien watched his every move, her silver eyes never leaving him, her body tense despite her weakness. "I'm going to try to stop the bleeding first," Kalen explained, knowing communication was impossible but needing to fill the silence. "Then we'll deal with the rest." The shoulder wound was deep, likely from shrapnel during whatever incident had forced her into the escape pod. He cleaned it carefully, noting that her blood coagulated more slowly than a human's would. The wound sealant seemed to work on her tissue, thankfully. As he worked, a particularly strong contraction made her cry out, a sound somewhere between a human moan and a musical tone. The next several hours tested every bit of Kalen's medical knowledge and improvisational skills. With no way to monitor fetal vitals reliably, he had to rely on the mother's reactions and his own instincts. The contractions grew stronger, more frequent, and her strength was clearly fading. Twice he thought he'd lose her, her breathing becoming so shallow he could barely detect it. But each time she rallied, her determination evident in her silver gaze. Near the end, when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, she grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. Her eyes locked with his, and in that moment, something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, or a plea. Whatever it was, Kalen nodded. "I won't give up if you don't," he promised. And then, suddenly it was happening. With one final, tremendous effort from the alien mother, new life entered the harsh world of Cygnus X-2. The infant was tiny, impossibly delicate, with skin a deeper purple than its mother's, and the same feathery growths already visible on its scalp. For one terrifying moment, it didn't move, didn't breathe. Kalen's training took over. He cleared the infant's airways, stimulated its chest with gentle pressure, all while speaking soft encouragement. "Come on, little one. Your mother fought too hard for you to give up now." The baby's first breath came as a gasp, followed by a cry so unlike a human infant's. Musical tones layered with clicking sounds, that Kaylin almost laughed in relief. The infant lived. Against all odds, in this frozen wasteland, new life had found a way. The mother's hands reached weakly for her child, and Kaylin placed the swaddled infant against her chest. Her feathery crest flared slightly, the silver tips catching the light as she gazed down at her offspring. For a moment, the universe seemed to hold its breath. Then her head fell back, eyes closing, her body going limp. "No, no, no," Kaylin muttered, checking her vital signs. She lived, but barely. Blood loss, exhaustion, and the trauma of childbirth had pushed her to the edge. The next few hours would determine whether she would survive to know the child she'd fought so hard to bring into the world. Working frantically, Kaylin set up an intravenous hydration system, modifying it for what he guessed was her body's chemistry. He synthesized blood volume expanders from the station's dwindling medical supplies and maintained a careful watch on her temperature, which seemed naturally lower than a human's, but was dropping dangerously even by that standard. The infant presented its own challenges. Kaylin had no idea what it should eat, how to care for it properly. After sterilizing his hands again, he performed basic assessments as gently as possible: weight, reflexes, respiratory rate. The child seemed healthy by any standard he could guess at, but fussed continuously when separated from its mother. "I know," he told the tiny being. "I'm not who you want, but she needs to rest right now." Improvising, he created a small warming unit next to the mother's bed, placing the infant where it could maintain contact with her skin while Kaylin monitored them both. For 2 days, he barely slept, checking vitals, adjusting medications, ensuring hydration. He talked continuously to both of them, telling stories of Earth, of his life before the Helix 7 disaster, of the strange and beautiful ice formations that sometimes appeared after Cygnus X2's rare methane rainfall. On the 3rd day, the mother opened her eyes. The change was immediate. She scrambled backward on the bed despite her weakness, one arm sweeping protectively over her child while the other raised defensively. Strange, musical sounds emerged from her throat, clearly distressed. Kaylin stepped back, hands raised to show he meant no harm. "It's okay," he said gently. "You're safe. You both are." She didn't understand, of course, but his retreat seemed to calm her slightly. Her silver eyes darted around the medical bay, assessing threats, exits, resources. A survivor's evaluation. She held her child closer, checking it for injury. Finding none, some of the tension left her shoulders. Over the next few days, a cautious routine developed. Kaylin would approach slowly, always announcing himself with soft words, always showing his hands. He'd place food, simple nutrition packs he'd synthesized to match what he guessed were her dietary needs, and fresh water at the edge of her reach, then back away. Only then would she take them, never turning her back to him, never allowing her child out of her protective embrace. The infant, whom Kaylin had mentally started calling Cinder for the subtle iridescent glow their skin sometimes took on in certain light, grew stronger daily. Their eyes, silver like their mother's, but with flecks of deeper blue, began to track movement. Their cries became more varied, more communicative. It was Cinder who first bridged the gap between their worlds. On the 7th day, while Kaylin was replacing a filtration component in the medical bay's air system, the infant reached out a tiny hand toward the light reflecting off his tools. The mother, still weak but recovering, watched tensely but didn't pull the child away. Kaylin smiled and gently moved his hand so the reflection danced on the wall. The infant made a sound, not a cry this time, but something like a coo, a happy sound. Their mother's crest feathers rippled slightly, perhaps in surprise. "Your child likes light," Kaylin said softly. "Makes sense. It must have been dark in that pod for too long." To his astonishment, the mother mimicked his speech pattern with sounds of her own, then touched her chest lightly. The gesture was unmistakable, an introduction. "Kaylin," he said, pointing to himself. My name is Kaylin. She repeated the sound, approximating his name with her different vocal structure, then touched her chest again. Lyra, she said carefully, the syllables musical and elongated. Lyra, Kaylin repeated, smiling. And this little one? He gestured toward the infant, careful not to move too close. Lyra hesitated, then gently touched the child's forehead. Alara, she said, the name flowing like water. Alara, Kaylin echoed. It's beautiful. Something changed after that exchange of names. The wall between them didn't fall completely, but a door had opened. Lyra began watching Kaylin's daily tasks with open curiosity rather than suspicion. She allowed him to examine Alara more thoroughly, though never without her supervision. When he brought her clothing, old research uniforms modified to accommodate her different body structure, she accepted them with a gesture that might have been gratitude. The first real crisis came 2 weeks after Lyra's arrival. The station's water recycling system, overtaxed by supporting 3 lives instead of 1, developed a critical fault. Toxic compounds began leaching into the drinking supply, causing immediate symptoms: dizziness, nausea, disorientation. Kaylin noticed at first, his vision blurring as he analyzed the latest growth charts he'd been keeping for Alara. By the time he identified the source, Lyra had begun showing symptoms as well, her lavender skin taking on a grayish tinge. The water, he managed to say, pointing to the storage containers. Don't drink. Contaminated. Whether she understood his words or just his urgent tone, Lyra immediately pulled Alara away from the small bottle of water she'd been about to give the child. Her silver eyes widened in alarm as she noticed Kaylin's deteriorating condition. Fighting through his growing disorientation, Kaylin staggered to the environmental control room. The filtration system needed a complete recalibration and replacement of several components. Under normal circumstances, it would be challenging but manageable. In his current state, with the toxins already affecting his motor control and cognition, it seemed nearly impossible. He'd barely begun when he felt a presence beside him. Lyra stood there, clearly fighting her own symptoms but determined. She pointed to the tools, then to herself, then made a repair motion. You understand this system? Kaylin asked, amazed. Lyra touched her temple, then gestured to the filtration array. Her expression conveyed a clear message. This technology is familiar to me. Working together, despite language barriers and increasing symptoms, they managed the repairs. Lyra's slender fingers proved adept at manipulating the smaller components that Kaylin's larger hand struggled with. Her intuitive understanding of certain technical principles suggested a highly advanced technological background. By the time they finished, both were barely conscious, but the system readings had returned to normal parameters. The recovery period strengthened their tentative bond. As they regained their strength, Kaylin began deliberately sharing more about his daily activities, demonstrating rather than just doing. He showed Lyra how the hydroponics system worked, how he maintained the station's power core, how he monitored the brutal weather patterns outside. In return, Lyra began sharing small aspects of herself, using gestures and drawings made with a light stylus on a spare datapad. She sketched images of plants unlike any Kaylin had seen, geometric structures that might have been buildings or ships, star patterns from skies he'd never witnessed. One evening, as Kaylin sat recalibrating his scanner, he felt a light touch on his shoulder. Lyra stood beside him, Alara sleeping peacefully in a sling she'd fashioned. In her free hand, she held 2 cups of the herbal tea he'd been synthesizing from the hydroponics bay. The gesture, so simple, so domestic, struck Kaylin deeply. He accepted the cup, their fingers brushing briefly. The contact wasn't accidental. Lyra maintained it for a moment longer than necessary, her silver eyes meeting his. "Thank you," he said softly, meaning for far more than just the tea. She nodded once, as if understanding perfectly, and settled beside him, watching his work with quiet interest as Alara slept against her chest. The disaster came without warning. An old long-range scanner, part of the station's original equipment that Kaylin had never fully deactivated, suddenly powered up during a routine system diagnostic. Before he could stop it, it broadcast a brief but powerful signal, a standard Colonial Science Authority identification pulse, harmless in itself, but a beacon to anyone monitoring frequencies in this sector. The scanner powered down as quickly as it had activated, but the damage was done. Kalen stared at the transmission logs in horror, calculating how far the signal might have reached. Far enough, potentially, to alert whoever had caused Lyra to flee in that escape pod. When he explained what had happened, showing Lyra the scanner and the transmission data, her reaction confirmed his worst fears. She backed away, clutching Alara tightly, her crest feathers flattening against her scalp in what he now recognized as extreme distress. Musical sounds poured from her, faster and higher pitched than he'd ever heard. "I'm sorry," Kalen said desperately. "I didn't know it would do that. I should have dismantled it years ago." Lyra's distress turned to frantic activity. She began gathering the few possessions she had, extra clothes, the blanket Alara preferred, the data pad she used for drawing. Her intentions were clear. She was preparing to run again. "Lyra, wait," Kalen said, gently catching her arm. "Where would you go? The surface temperatures would kill you both in minutes. The pod you arrived in is damaged beyond repair." Her silver eyes met his, filled with a fear so profound it shook him. For weeks they'd been building trust, creating a fragile sense of safety. Now it was crumbling. Taking a risk, Kalen activated the station's main view screen, bringing up the external camera feeds. The endless white landscape of Cygnus X-2 spread before them, blizzard conditions reducing visibility to mere meters. "There's nowhere to go," he said softly. "But I promise you, I will do everything I can to protect you both. Whatever you're running from, I won't let them take you or Alara." Lyra stared at the screen, then at him. Slowly, her frantic movements stilled. She set down the items she'd been gathering and, with visible reluctance, made a decision. She picked up the datapad and began drawing rapidly. The images she created told a story, even without words. A society divided by rigid castes, indicated by different color markings. Herself, shown in a facility with others like her, but without the freedom of movement. A scientific procedure of some kind, resulting in her pregnancy. Then discovery, Alara's genetic scan showing an anomaly, represented by a spiral pattern that shouldn't have been there. Escape, pursuit, the tiny pod, the desperate journey. The final image showed the spiral pattern, the genetic anomaly, more clearly. It resembled a double helix, but with additional structures Kalen didn't recognize. Lyra pointed to it, then to herself, then made a negative gesture. Next, she pointed to it again, then to Alara, and nodded firmly. "Alara has something genetically that you don't," Kalen interpreted. "Something they didn't intend. Something they fear." Lyra's crest feathers rippled in what he now recognized as affirmation. Understanding dawned slowly. "They created you to bear children with specific traits," he said, the horror of it sinking in. "But Alara developed something unexpected, something that challenged their control." Lyra couldn't understand his exact words, but she seemed to follow his comprehension. She touched her chest, then made a gesture like something being extracted from her, then pointed to a drawing of what might have been a laboratory. "They used you," Kalen said quietly, "as a vessel, a biological container for their experiments." She nodded, her eyes filling with a silvery fluid, tears, he realized with a jolt. Then she touched Alara's sleeping form with infinite tenderness, followed by a gesture toward freedom, toward flight. "You ran to save her," Kalen said. "Not just yourself. Her." Lyra nodded again, more emphatically. The moment hung between them, heavy with shared understanding. Then, slowly, Kalen reached for the datapad. It was his turn to share truth. He drew crude but recognizable images. A space station with a distinctive ring structure, himself at a control panel, warning lights. En explosion, bodies floating in space. Himself in a small ship, fleeing. The frozen landscape of Cygnus X-2. "I designed safety systems for a research station called Helix 7, he explained, knowing she wouldn't understand the words but needing to say them anyway. "There was a cascade failure in the reactor cooling system. The safeguards I designed failed. 42 people died while I watched from the observation deck. His hands shook as he finished the drawing. I should have been able to save them. My systems should have worked. I've replayed it 1,000 times in my mind, try to understand what went wrong. In the end, the review board cleared me of direct responsibility. Mechanical failure, they said, not design flaw. But I couldn't face the families of the dead. I couldn't bear their forgiveness when I couldn't forgive myself. So I ran just like you did. I've been hiding here ever since. He set down the stylus, suddenly exhausted. We're both running from something. Both haunted. Lyra studied his drawings, her expression shifting from fear to something softer, recognition, perhaps, or empathy. She reached out slowly and laid her hand over his. The touch was gentle but firm, a connection offered without reservation. In that moment, something fundamental changed between them. They were no longer just two beings thrown together by circumstance, survivor and rescuer. They were equal, sharing a burden, each carrying their own guilt and fear, each recognizing it in the other. Later that night, as the station's systems cycled into night mode and the distant sun of Cygnus set beyond the ice plains, they sat together in the observatory dome. Alara slept peacefully between them, making occasional soft sounds that might have been dreams. Above them, through the transparent panels of the dome, the aurora of Cygnus X-2 danced in shimmering curtains of blue and green. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Kaylin said softly. "For all the harshness of this planet, it creates moments of incredible beauty." Lyra didn't understand his words, but she nodded, her silver eyes reflecting the dancing lights above. She shifted slightly, closing the distance between them, until her shoulder touched his. The contact was deliberate, significant. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, Kaylin put his arm around her shoulders. Instead of tensing or retreating, Lyra leaned into him, her head coming to rest against his chest. Her feathery crest tickled his chin, carrying a subtle scent like cinnamon and ozone. They sat like that for a long time, watching the aurora, listening to Alara's gentle breathing. No words were spoken, none were needed. In the vastness of space, on a forgotten outpost at the edge of known territory, two broken beings had found something unexpected: understanding, acceptance, connection. Perhaps even the beginnings of healing. Weeks passed, then months. The research station, once a place of self-imposed exile and solitude for Kaylin, gradually transformed. Spaces that had been shut down to conserve power were reactivated. The hydroponics bay expanded to accommodate new plant varieties that Lyra helped cultivate, strange hybrids adapted from her memory of her homeworld's flora. The medical bay became a nursery as well, filled with toys Kaylin fabricated from spare parts and soft materials. Alara grew rapidly, her developmental milestones both familiar and alien to Kaylin. She crawled earlier than a human infant would, but took longer to vocalize. Her crest feathers lengthened and began changing colors according to her moods: deep blue when content, vibrant purple when excited, silvery white when tired. She showed an almost preternatural fascination with light, reaching for illumination sources before she could even sit up independently. Communication between Kaylin and Lyra evolved into a complex system of gestures, drawings, and shared words. Kaylin learned that Lyra's species communicated partly through subtle movements of their crest feathers, a nuanced language of micro-expressions beyond human capability. In return, he taught her more technical terms, the names of tools and components she seemed inherently drawn to. There were difficult moments. Nights when Lyra would wake screaming from nightmares, her crest feathers rigid with terror, certain that her pursuers had found them. Days when Kaylin would fall into dark silence, the anniversaries of the helix, 7 disaster weighing on him like a physical presence. Times when the strain of survival on Cygnus X-2 tested them both: equipment failures, resource shortages, the psychological toll of isolation. But there were beautiful moments too. The first time Alara reached for Kaylin without hesitation, tiny fingers wrapping around his much larger ones with complete trust. The evening Lyra presented him with a small crystal formation she'd discovered during a carefully planned excursion to a nearby cave system, its structure naturally amplifying light in patterns that reminded her of home. The night they first shared a bed, not for physical intimacy, but for comfort and closeness, Elara nestled safely between them. One day, as Cygnus's distant sun reached its zenith, they sat in what had once been the station's communal dining area. Kalen had repurposed the space into something like a living room, with salvage furniture arranged around a central heating element. Elara, now able to toddle short distances, practiced walking between them, her silver blue eyes alight with determination. "She's getting faster," Kalen observed, smiling as he caught her when she stumbled. "Soon she'll be outrunning both of us." Lyra's crest feathers rippled in amusement. "Fast," she agreed, one of the human words she'd mastered. Then, in her own musical language, she added something that made her expression turn wistful. Kalen had come to recognize that particular tone. "You're thinking of home," he said gently. Her silver eyes met his, and she nodded. Not for the first time, he wondered what her world looked like, what sort of sky she had grown up under, what kind of society she had known before becoming a captive vessel for others' genetic ambitions. Before he could pursue that thought, the station's proximity alarm sounded, a harsh, blaring noise that made Elara cry out in distress and Lyra freeze in terror. "It's all right," Kalen said quickly, though his heart raced. "It's just the perimeter alert. Probably an ice formation shifting too close to the sensors." But even as he spoke, he was moving toward the control console. Lyra, right behind him with Elara clutched protectively to her chest. The external camera feeds showed nothing at first, just the endless white landscape, the bitter wind sculpting snow into drifting patterns. Then, at the edge of visual range, something moved. Something that wasn't natural, wasn't part of the frozen environment of Cygnus X2. A ship. Not large, perhaps capable of carrying a dozen occupants at most, but advanced, sleeker, and more elegant than the utilitarian human vessels Kalen was familiar with. Its hull had a faint, iridescent quality that reminded him of Lyra's skin. When he turned to her, the confirmation of his fears was written in her expression. Her crest feathers had flattened completely against her skull. Her pupils contracted to pinpoints of terror. She clutched Elara so tightly that the child whimpered in discomfort. "They found us," Kalen whispered. The next hour passed in a frenzy of activity. Although they had never spoken directly about the possibility of discovery, both had known this day might come. Subconsciously, they had prepared. Kalen rushed to activate the station's minimal defensive systems, designed more to repel natural threats than sentient invaders, but better than nothing. He uploaded a virus to the station's communication array that would corrupt any attempts to access their systems remotely. Meanwhile, Lyra gathered emergency supplies into a pack. Water, nutrition packs, medical essentials, thermal blankets. "The maintenance tunnels," Kalen said, pointing to a schematic on the main console. "They run beneath the primary structure, connecting to an emergency shelter on the eastern ridge. It was designed as a fallback if the main station's life support failed." Lyra nodded, understanding the plan without needing every word translated. She secured Elara in a carrier against her chest, the child mercifully quiet now, as if sensing the gravity of the situation. The utility access panel in the floor of the storage bay revealed a narrow ladder leading down into darkness. Kalen activated his wrist illuminator, casting a blue-white glow onto metal rungs coated with years of disuse. "I'll go first," he said, already starting down the ladder. "Test the stability." The maintenance tunnel was cramped but navigable, forcing them to move in a half-crouch. The air was stale but breathable, the environmental systems having maintained minimal circulation even in these unused spaces. They moved as quickly as they dared, Kalen leading with a portable scanner to detect structural weaknesses ahead, Lyra following with Elara, her natural night vision proving superior to his technology in the dimness. Above them, through the metal and insulation of the station's floor, they heard the muffled sounds of intrusion, the outer airlock cycling, footsteps moving through corridors, voices speaking in the musical tones of Lyra's language, but harsher, more clipped. How far to the emergency shelter? Lyra asked in carefully practiced human speech, her voice barely above a whisper. Another half-kilometer, Kalen replied. But we need to be careful. This section hasn't been maintained in years. As if the station itself had heard his warning, a deep groaning sound emanated from somewhere ahead of them. The temperature in the tunnel had been dropping steadily as they moved away from the main structure's heating systems. And now the differential was causing metal to contract, creating dangerous stress points. They had advanced perhaps another 50 meters when a section of the tunnel ahead collapsed with a terrible shriek of tearing metal. The path forward disappeared beneath twisted debris and compacted snow that had somehow infiltrated the structure. Back, Kalen hissed, already turning around. We'll have to find another route. But retreat wasn't an option either. As they retraced their steps, the scanner picked up multiple biosignatures moving through the main station above them. The searchers were methodically checking every room, every possible hiding place. It would be only a matter of time before they discovered the access panel to the maintenance tunnels. Trapped between the collapsed section ahead and the searchers behind, Kalen felt desperation rising. He studied the tunnel schematics on his wrist display, looking for alternatives, escape routes, anything. There, a vertical shaft that connected to the surface, part of the original station's ventilation system. It was narrow, likely partially obstructed after years of disuse, but it might be their only hope. This way, he said, leading Lyra down a side passage so narrow they had to move sideways. There's a surface access point ahead. The shaft was exactly where the schematics indicated, but as Kalen had feared, years of thermal cycling had damaged it. Ice had formed between the metal segments, creating blockages and weakening the structure. It would be a dangerous climb, but the alternative was capture. I'll go first, Kalen said, testing the lowest rung of the access ladder. If it holds me, it will certainly hold you. The climb was nightmarish. Twice, rungs broke under Kalen's weight, forcing him to scramble for handholds on the shaft's icy walls. The higher they climbed, the colder it became, until each breath felt like inhaling shards of glass. Behind him, Lyra moved with a natural grace that belied the danger, one arm securing Alara while the other found purchase on the treacherous ladder. Finally, Kalen's hand struck the surface hatch. It was frozen shut, years of accumulated ice sealing it more effectively than any lock. Bracing himself as best he could, he activated the plasma torch attachment on his multi-tool and began cutting through the ice. The hatch opened with a rush of frigid air and swirling snow. The storm had intensified since the alien ship's arrival, visibility reduced to mere meters. Kalen pulled himself onto the surface, then reached back to help Lyra and Alara up. The full force of Cygnus X2's environment hit them immediately. Even through their thermal suits, the cold was paralyzing. Alara whimpered, her tiny face buried against her mother's chest for protection against the punishing wind. Lyra's crest feathers had pulled tight against her scalp, a biological defense mechanism against the extreme temperature. We need shelter, Kalen shouted over the howling wind, his words torn away almost before Lyra could hear them. The emergency bunker is 2 kilometers northeast. We'll never make it in this visibility. Lyra pointed urgently back toward the station, then made a circular motion with her hand. Kalen understood immediately. They needed to circle around, find another entrance, perhaps approach the emergency shelter from a different angle. Moving through the blizzard was like wading through invisible resistance. Each step required tremendous effort, the accumulated snow reaching mid-thigh in some drifts. Kalen kept one hand on Lyra's arm, terrified of losing her in the wide-out conditions. His wrist scanner was their only guide, its faint blue glow barely visible even when he held it directly before his face. They had covered perhaps 500 meters when Lyra suddenly pulled him down into a crouch. At first, Kalen thought she had stumbled, but then he saw her silver eyes fixed on something ahead. Following her gaze, he caught a glimpse of moving lights through the swirling snow, searchlights, methodically sweeping the area around the station. The pursuers had realized their quarry had gone to the surface. This way, Kalen mouthed, pointing to a ridge of ice formations that might provide temporary cover. They crawled rather than walked, using the snow drifts as concealment, the wind masking what little sound they made. The ice ridge provided minimal shelter, but enough to catch their breath and reassess. Alara had gone frighteningly quiet, her tiny body shivering despite the insulated carrier. Lyra's breathing had become labored, each exhale creating crystalline patterns in the frigid air. "We can't stay out here much longer," Kalen said, more to himself than to Lyra. He checked his scanner again, trying to triangulate their position relative to the emergency shelter. "It's still over a kilometer away. In these conditions—" He didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what it meant. In these conditions, they might not make it. The human cold weather gear Kalen had modified for Lyra wasn't designed for extended exposure, and Alara had even less protection. Hypothermia would set in within minutes, not hours. As if reading his thoughts, Lyra placed her hand on his wrist, her touch surprisingly warm despite everything. Her silver eyes met his, conveying a message clearer than any words could. She would not surrender. Not after everything she'd endured to protect her child. Not after finding someone who had risked everything to help them. That silent determination rekindled something in Kalen. He surveyed their surroundings with renewed focus, forcing his cold-numbed mind to work. The emergency shelter was too far, but there had to be an alternative. "The thermal vents," he said suddenly, memory sparking. The geological survey team that originally established this station found a network of thermal vents 500 meters north of here. They tap into Cygnus's core heat. If they're still active. Lyra seemed to grasp his meaning immediately. She nodded, adjusting Alara's carrier to better shield the infant from the elements. The journey to the thermal vents was a nightmare of cold and disorientation. Twice they nearly walked into the path of search parties, saved only by Lyra's superior hearing that detected the subtle changes in the storm's howl caused by moving bodies. Once, Kalen stumbled into a hidden crevasse, catching himself at the last moment but wrenching his shoulder painfully in the process. When they finally reached the coordinates of the vents, disappointment hit like a physical blow. What had once been an open field of steam and relative warmth was now largely crusted over with ice. The geological activity diminished to a fraction of its former intensity, but not entirely gone. At the far edge of the field, a faint plume of vapor rose steadily into the storm, immediately whipped away by the wind but unmistakable. A single vent remained active, its heat melting the surrounding snow into a shallow depression. They half ran, half slid down to it. The temperature rose noticeably as they approached, the brutal edge of Cygnus X2's cold blunted by the planet's internal warmth. The vent itself was a narrow fissure in the rocky substrate beneath the ice, only about 2 meters across, but emitting enough heat to create a survivable microclimate around it. Kalen immediately began clearing snow, exposing more of the warm rock beneath. "We need to create a shelter," he explained between labored breaths. "Use the snow as insulation, the vent for heat." Working together despite exhaustion and cold, they constructed a crude snow shelter beside the vent. Kalen used his multi-tool to cut blocks from the harder snowpack while Lyra arranged them in a dome-like structure. Within an hour, they had created a small enclosed space, large enough for the three of them if they stayed close together. Inside, with the entrance blocked except for a small ventilation hole, the temperature rose to a tolerable level. Not comfortable, but no longer immediately life-threatening. Alara's shivers subsided gradually as Lyra held her close, both of them wrapped in the emergency thermal blankets from Kalen's pack. "They'll find us eventually," Kalen said quietly, massaging feeling back into his numb fingers. "They have technology we don't, probably thermal imaging that can cut through the storm. But maybe not until morning. The magnetic properties of this region interfere with certain scanning frequencies. We have a few hours at least." Lyra nodded, her expression solemn. Then, hesitantly, she reached out and touched his chest, right over his heart. With her other arm still cradling Alara, she drew her hand in a line between the three of them, then made a gesture of unity. The meaning was unmistakable. Whatever happens, we face it together. Emotion welled up unexpectedly in Kalen's throat. After years of self-imposed isolation, of carrying the weight of past failures alone, the simple gesture of inclusion, of family, struck him profoundly. Together, he agreed, his voice rough. They sat in silence for a time, conserving energy, sharing warmth. Alara drifted into an exhausted sleep between them. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, nature's fury providing a temporary shield against their pursuers. "Who are they?" Kalen finally asked, though he knew Lyra's language skills weren't advanced enough for a complex answer. "Why are they so determined to find you?" "To find Alara." Lyra seemed to consider how to respond with her limited vocabulary. After a moment, she pointed to her own eyes, then to Alara's, then made a negative gesture. "Her eyes are different from yours," Kalen interpreted. "Different from your people." Lyra nodded, then touched her crest feathers, which had relaxed somewhat in the relative warmth. She indicated the subtle blue undertones in the silver, then pointed to Alara's crest, which had distinct patterns of iridescent blue even when retracted. "Genetic markers," Kalen guessed. "Visible traits that show her heritage." Again, Lyra nodded. She held up 2 fingers, then made a sweeping gesture that encompassed an imaginary crowd, followed by bringing the fingers together. "2 groups," Kalen said slowly. "That came together. A hybrid." Lyra tapped her nose in the human gesture of affirmation she'd learned from him. Then her expression darkened. She made a motion like something being taken forcibly, followed by the gesture for scientific experimentation they'd established in their improvised communication system. "They took genetic material," Kalen said, anger rising as he began to understand. "They created hybrids through force, through experimentation, without consent." Lyra's silver eyes clouded with painful memories, but she continued her explanation. She pointed to herself, then made a gesture of containment, of imprisonment. Then she pointed to Alara and made a different sign, something breaking free, evolving beyond control. "You were created to be a vessel," Kalen said, the horror of it fully sinking in now. "But Alara developed differently than expected. She has traits they didn't anticipate, didn't program for." Lyra confirmed this with a solemn nod. She touched her temple, then Alara's, and made an expanding motion while opening her hand like a flower blooming. "Mental abilities," Kalen whispered. "She has mental abilities they didn't expect." The implications were staggering. If Lyra's people, or at least the faction that had imprisoned her, were capable of such advanced genetic manipulation, what would they do with a child who had developed beyond their parameters? A child whose very existence proved that their control was not absolute. Lyra made one final gesture, touching her heart, then Kalen's, then Alara's. She drew them together, then made a protective circle around all 3. "We protect her," Kalen translated. "Together." He reached out, taking Lyra's free hand in both of his. "I promise you, I will do everything in my power to keep you both safe. Whatever it takes." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken emotions. Then, with a gentleness that belied her alien physiology, Lyra leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his, a gesture of profound trust and connection in her culture, though Kalen couldn't know that. All he knew was the overwhelming feeling of rightness, of belonging that flooded through him at the contact. Their brief peace was shattered by a sound that penetrated even the howling storm, the high-pitched whine of engines, much closer than before. The search parties were converging on their location. "They found us," Kalen said, reluctantly pulling away from Lyra and moving to the shelter's small viewing hole. Through it, he could see faint lights approaching through the blizzard, more organized now, moving with purpose rather than searching randomly. He turned back to Lyra, who was already preparing to move, securing Alara more tightly against her. The infant stirred but didn't wake, mercifully unaware of the danger closing in. "Wait," Kalen said suddenly. An idea had formed, desperate, probably futile, but the only option he could see. The research station has an emergency beacon. It's designed to cut through Cygnus's magnetic interference, broadcast on colonial authority frequencies. If I can reach it, activate it. Lyra's expression showed understanding immediately. Outside help. A third party that might complicate things enough to create an opportunity. But her next gesture was a protest, pointing to him, then making a slashing motion across her throat. Too dangerous. They would kill him. They want you and Alara alive, Kaelin countered. Me. They have no reason to keep breathing. But I know this terrain, I know the station's systems. I can create a diversion. Draw them away while you head for the emergency shelter. It's our only chance. Lyra's silver eyes filled with that strange, metallic fluid that served as her tears. She shook her head vehemently, clutching his arm with surprising strength. I have to try, Kaelin insisted gently. For both of you. For all of us. The searchlights were closer now, maybe 200 meters away, and closing. They had minutes at most before discovery. With painful reluctance, Lyra released her grip on his arm. Instead, she placed her hand over his heart once more, this time pressing something into his palm as she did so. Looking down, Kaelin saw a small crystal, the one she had found in the cave system months ago, the one that reminded her of home. A token, a talisman, perhaps even a promise. I'll come back for you, he whispered, closing his fingers around the crystal. Wait for me at the emergency shelter. If I'm not there by dawn. He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the alternative. Instead, he placed his hand gently against Alara's sleeping cheek, feeling the incredible softness of her skin, the fragile warmth of new life they had brought into the world together. Then, before his courage could falter, he slipped out of the snow shelter and into the storm, deliberately moving away from the direction of the emergency shelter, hoping to draw the attention of the searchers. The cold struck him like a physical blow after the relative warmth of their shelter. He moved as quickly as the conditions allowed, occasionally glancing back to ensure the searchlights were following him rather than continuing toward where Lyra and Alara remained hidden. To his relief, several of the lights changed course, pursuing his tracks in the fresh snow. The route back to the research station was treacherous, doubly so in the dark with visibility reduced to near zero. Kaelin relied on memory and his wrist scanner, which was beginning to malfunction in the extreme cold. Twice he fell, once sliding nearly 20 meters down an icy incline before managing to arrest his descent. His body, already stressed from the earlier escape and shelter building, protested each movement with increasing pain. When the dark silhouette of the research station finally appeared through the storm, Kaelin almost sobbed with relief. He approached cautiously, noting that the alien ship had landed on the station's eastern pad. It was even more impressive up close, sleek, predatory, clearly built for inter-system travel rather than just atmospheric flight. The station's main entrance was guarded, two figures visible despite the swirling snow. They were similar to Lyra in basic physiology, but taller, their crest feathers longer and more rigidly controlled. They carried weapons of some kind, slender but undoubtedly lethal. Kaelin circled around, seeking an alternative entrance. The maintenance hatch they had used for their escape would be discovered by now, but there was another access point, a rarely used emergency exit on the station's western face, designed as a backup in case of depressurization events. Moving silently despite his exhaustion, Kaelin approached the emergency exit. It was unguarded, either overlooked or considered too insignificant to watch. The access panel beside it still responded to his palm print, the system recognizing him as authorized personnel despite years of disuse. The door slid open with a hiss that seemed impossibly loud to Kaelin's heightened senses. He slipped inside, finding himself in a narrow utility corridor lit only by emergency strips along the floor. The air inside was noticeably warmer, but Kaelin had no time to appreciate it. If the hatch's activation had triggered an alert, security would converge on his location within minutes. Moving as quietly as possible, he made his way through the back corridors of the station, avoiding the main areas where he could hear movement and voices. The sounds of the alien language, musical like Lyra's but harsher, more clipped, echoed occasionally through the ventilation system. The emergency beacon was located in the station's communication hub, a space Kalen rarely entered since establishing his exile. As he approached it, he heard voices from within, at least two of the aliens discussing something in urgent tones. Retreating silently, Kalen considered his options. He needed a diversion, something to draw the security personnel away from the communications hub long enough for him to access the emergency beacon. The environmental control room was nearby and typically unoccupied. If he could trigger a station-wide environmental alert, perhaps a simulated breach in the dome or a life support malfunction, it might create enough confusion to give him the opening he needed. The plan worked better than he had dared hope. By rerouting critical systems and triggering multiple false alarms simultaneously, Kalen created an apparent catastrophic failure in the station's primary life support system. Warning klaxons blared throughout the structure, automated voices announcing imminent oxygen depletion and advising immediate evacuation protocols. In the ensuing chaos, Kalen slipped into the now-abandoned communications hub. The emergency beacon was exactly where he remembered it, a self-contained unit separate from the station's main communication array. It was designed to operate independently even if the rest of the station's systems failed, powered by its own long-life battery, and connected to a dedicated transmission dish. His fingers flew over the controls, programming a distress call that would broadcast continuously once activated. He included basic information, his identity, the station's location, and a brief message: alien incursion at research station Cygnus Delta. Multiple hostile entities. Request immediate colonial authority intervention. As his finger hovered over the activation button, doubts suddenly seized him. The colonial authority had no official presence in this sector. By the time any help arrived, if they chose to respond at all to a distress call from a man officially listed as missing, presumed dead, it could be days, even weeks. Far too late to help Lyra and Alara. But what other option did he have? The beacon was his only means of calling for outside assistance. At the very least, its activation might create additional confusion among the alien pursuers, perhaps enough to. His thoughts were interrupted by a sound behind him, the soft hiss of the door sliding open. Kalen spun around, already knowing what he would see but hoping desperately to be wrong. 4 of them stood in the doorway. Like Lyra, but not like her at all. The same basic physiology, the same crest feathers, but their posture was rigid, controlled. Their eyes, silver like Lyra's but colder, calculating, assessed him with clinical detachment. 3 carried weapons openly, slim devices that hummed with barely contained energy. The 4th, slightly taller than the others and wearing elaborate decorations on his crest, carried no visible weapon but radiated authority. Human, the lead alien said, the word accented but clearly understandable. You interfere in matters beyond your understanding. Kalen felt a chill that had nothing to do with Cygnus X2's frozen environment. They spoke his language. They had prepared for this encounter, studied humanity enough to communicate. This was no random pursuit. This was a carefully planned operation. Understand enough, Kalen replied, subtly shifting to place his body between the aliens and the emergency beacon's controls. I understand you created Lyra to be a vessel for your experiments. I understand you hunt her and her child because the child developed beyond your control. A flicker of surprise passed across the leader's features, rippling through his crest feathers before being quickly suppressed. The vessel communicated with you. Interesting. Its language capabilities were intentionally limited. Kalen corrected, anger flaring despite the danger. She is not a vessel. Her name is Lyra. The leader made a dismissive gesture. Designations are irrelevant. The vessel and its offspring represent significant property and research investment. Their retrieval is non-negotiable. Property, research investment. The cold, clinical terminology made Kalen's blood boil. These beings saw Lyra and Alara as objects, as experimental subjects, not as living beings with rights and dignity. They are not your property, Kalen said, his voice low and dangerous. They are under my protection now. The alien security personnel shifted slightly, weapons adjusting their aim. The leader, however, seemed more curious than threatened. "Fascinating," he said. "You have formed an attachment to the vessel and its offspring. This was not anticipated in our behavioral models of your species." "There's a lot about humanity your models don't account for," Kalen replied. His hand inched toward the emergency beacon's activation control. If he could just press it before they stopped him. The leader noticed the movement. "Your primitive distress signal will not save them, human. By the time any assistance arrives, we will be long gone from this system, the vessel and offspring secured." "Her name is Lyra," Kalen insisted again. "And the child is Alara. They are people, not experiments." For a moment, something like genuine confusion flickered across the leader's features. "You misunderstand our purpose entirely. The genetic program that produced this vessel and its unusual offspring represents generations of careful development. The anomalous traits manifesting in the offspring are of tremendous scientific significance. So significant that you'd hunt them across space?" Kalen asked. "That you'd risk an interspecies incident by landing on a colonial authority research station?" The leader made a gesture that might have been the equivalent of a shrug. "This facility has been abandoned for years. Your presence was an unforeseen complication, but ultimately irrelevant." Irrelevant. The word struck Kalen with unexpected force. For 3 years he had hidden on this frozen rock, convinced of his own irrelevance, his inability to make a difference after his failure with Helix 7. Now, faced with beings who truly saw him as nothing more than an inconvenience, a glitch in their plans, something shifted within him. "I'm not irrelevant," Kalen said softly. Then, with sudden determination, "And neither are they." In one swift motion, he slammed his hand down on the emergency beacon's activation control. The console lit up as the system initiated the transmission dish on the station's exterior, beginning its deployment sequence. The reaction was immediate. One of the security personnel fired their weapon, a beam of concentrated energy that struck the console mere centimeters from Kalen's hand. The control panel sparked and smoked, but the damage came too late. The beacon had already begun broadcasting. "Restrain him," the leader ordered, his crest feathers rigid with anger. Kalen had no illusions about fighting them. Their physical strength likely exceeded his, and their weapons gave them an insurmountable advantage. But as they moved to apprehend him, alarms suddenly blared throughout the station, different from the false environmental alerts he had triggered earlier. "Proximity alert," an automated voice announced. "Unidentified vessel approaching. Collision course detected." For a heartbeat, everyone in the room froze. Then the leader barked orders in their native language, and 2 of the security personnel rushed from the room. The remaining guard kept his weapon trained on Kalen, while the leader accessed a communication device on his wrist. The distraction was exactly what Kalen needed. With the guard's attention momentarily divided between him and the new crisis, Kalen launched himself toward the door. The guard fired, the energy beam scorching the wall where Kalen had been standing a split second earlier. Kalen ran as he had never run before, through corridors he knew by heart after years of isolated existence. Behind him, he heard pursuit, angry voices calling out in that musical but harsh language. Ahead, through the transparent panels of the dome, he saw what had triggered the proximity alert. A small vessel, sleek and fast, executing a dangerously low pass over the research station. The Colonial Authority couldn't possibly have responded this quickly to his distress call. This was something else, but what? Questions would have to wait. Kalen needed to reach the Western emergency exit, get back outside, somehow make his way to the thermal vent where he hoped Lyra and Alara had already departed for the emergency shelter. The storm had intensified further, a wall of white fury visible through every external window he passed. The conditions would make pursuit more difficult, but would also render navigation nearly impossible. As he rounded the final corner toward the emergency exit, Kalen nearly collided with 2 more of the alien security personnel. They reacted with professional efficiency, one raising a weapon while the other moved to block his path. Desperation lent Kalen's strength and reflexes he didn't know he possessed. He ducked under the weapon, body checking the first guard into the wall with enough force to momentarily stun him. The second guard fired, the energy beam grazing Kalen's shoulder with searing pain. Ignoring the wound, Kalen reached the emergency exit and slammed his palm against the external release. The door slid open, and he hurled himself out into the storm, the howling wind and driving snow immediately enveloping him. He ran blindly at first, putting distance between himself and the station, knowing the guards would follow, but hoping the blizzard would cover his tracks. His injured shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, the cold air paradoxically both numbing and intensifying the pain. When he judged he had enough of a lead, Kalen paused to check his bearings. His wrist scanner was damaged, either from the weapon's impact or the extreme conditions, its display flickering erratically. Still, he could make out enough to orient himself toward the thermal vent where he had left Lyra and Alara. The journey back seemed to take an eternity. Each step was a battle against the storm and his own failing strength. The wound in his shoulder had stopped bleeding, frozen by the sub-zero temperatures, but the tissue damage was severe. His extremities were growing numb despite his thermal gear, hypothermia setting in despite his best efforts to maintain his core temperature. When he finally reached the area where the snow shelter should have been, Kalen's heart sank. Nothing remained but a disturbed area of snow, partially filled in by fresh drifts. Lyra and Alara were gone. Either they had followed his instructions and headed for the emergency shelter, or they had been discovered and captured. Kalen forced himself to think rationally despite his increasing disorientation. If they had been captured, the alien security forces would have returned to the station immediately with their prizes. The fact that they were still searching, that the unidentified vessel was still circling overhead, suggested Lyra and Alara remained free. The emergency shelter. It was his only hope, their only hope. Gathering what little strength remained to him, Kalen set off again, fighting through drifts that sometimes reached his waist, navigating by memory and sheer stubborn determination when his scanner finally failed completely. He fell several times, each time finding it harder to rise again. The cold worked its way deeper into his body with every passing minute, slowing his thoughts, numbing his pain, tempting him with the false comfort of simply lying down and resting just for a moment, the last thought of many who had died in Arctic conditions. When Kalen finally saw the outline of the emergency shelter through the storm, he initially thought it was a hallucination. The low, dome-shaped structure, half buried in accumulated snow, seemed to waver and shift in his vision. Only when he reached out and felt the solid metal of its outer hull did he accept it was real. The access panel responded sluggishly to his palm print, the mechanisms partially frozen. For a terrible moment, Kalen thought it wouldn't open, that he had come all this way only to die within meters of safety. Then, with a protesting groan, the door slid partially open, just enough for him to squeeze through into the darkness beyond. "Lyra," he called, his voice weak and raspy. "Alara." Silence answered him. The emergency shelter was cold, not as cold as outside, but nowhere near habitable temperature. The backup power systems had maintained minimal life support, but clearly no one had activated the main environmental controls. They weren't here. The realization hit Kalen with crushing force. Either they had never made it to the shelter, or they had come and gone, perhaps pursued, perhaps seeking better protection elsewhere. Either way, he had failed them. The last of his strength deserted him. Kalen collapsed against the inner wall, sliding down until he sat on the floor, his breath coming in painful gasps. The wound in his shoulder had begun to thaw enough to resume bleeding, a dark stain spreading slowly across his thermal suit. His consciousness wavered, darkness encroaching at the edges of his vision. This was how it would end, then. Alone again, as he had been for 3 years. Except now the solitude carried the weight of fresh failure, of promises broken. Lyra, Alara, the family he had found in the most unlikely circumstances, the connection that had begun healing wounds he hadn't even acknowledged. As consciousness slipped away, Kalen's hand closed around the crystal Lyra had given him. It seemed to pulse with warmth, though that was surely just his imagination, a final hallucination of a dying mind seeking comfort. He wasn't sure how much time had passed when awareness returned. Seconds, minutes, hours, all had lost meaning. What roused him was a sound, faint at first, then growing louder. The emergency shelter's outer door sliding open, admitting a rush of frozen air and swirling snow, followed by hurried movement. Kalen forced his eyes open, struggling to focus. A figure stood silhouetted against the still open door, familiar yet strange. Slender, graceful, with a crest of feather-like appendages that caught the faint emergency lighting. But not Lyra. This individual was taller, their crest longer and with different coloration, deep blue rather than silver-purple. Their clothing was form-fitting but practical, clearly designed for harsh environments. In their arms they held a small bundle, protectively cradled against the cold. "You must be Kalen," the stranger said in perfect, unaccented human speech. "She said you would come here." "Boo," Kalen managed, his voice barely audible. The stranger knelt beside him, shifting the bundle to reveal its precious contents. Alara, sleeping peacefully despite everything, her tiny face relaxed in the innocent slumber of infancy. "My name is Maris," the stranger said. "I am Lyra's clutchmate, what you might call a sister. I've been searching for her since she escaped the research facility." "The ship," Kalen realized. "That was you." Maris nodded. "I've been tracking her for months, always one step behind. When I detected the alien vessel entering this system, I knew they had found her before I could. I came as quickly as possible." "Lyra," Kalen said urgently, tried to rise despite his injuries. "Where is she?" Maris gently but firmly pressed him back down. "Conserve your strength. You're severely injured and hypothermic." "Tell me," Kalen insisted. Maris's expression, subtly different from Lyra's but still recognizable in its emotional cues, showed deep concern. "She gave Alara to me when I found them at the thermal vent. She said there was no time to explain, that I needed to take her child to safety while she led the pursuers away from both of you." The selflessness of the act hit Kalen like a physical blow. Lyra had sacrificed herself, deliberately drawing their hunters away to give Alara a chance at freedom. "We have to find her," Kalen said, forcing himself to his feet despite the pain and dizziness. "She can't face them alone." "You can barely stand," Maris objected. "And my responsibility is to Alara now. Lyra made me promise to protect her child above all else." "Then give me your tracker," Kalen said, his voice regaining some strength through sheer force of will. "Whatever you use to find Lyra, let me use it." Maris hesitated, clearly torn between honoring her clutchmate's wishes and acknowledging the depth of feeling evident in this human's determination. "She told me about you," Maris said finally. "How you saved them both when no one else would have. How you created a home for them when they had none." She shifted Alara to one arm and removed a small device from her belt. "This is keyed to Lyra's biological signature. It will lead you to her if she still lives." Kalen took the device, his cold-numbed fingers fumbling slightly. "Thank you." "The emergency medical kit is in the standard location," Maris said, nodding toward a cabinet on the far wall. "Treat your wounds and restore your core temperature before you go. You will be no help to her dead." The logic was irrefutable. As much as every moment felt critical, Kalen knew he would collapse within minutes if he ventured back into the storm in his current condition. Moving to the cabinet, he retrieved the emergency medical kit and quickly treated his shoulder wound with synthetic skin sealant and a localized analgesic. A thermal stimulator applied to his core helped raise his body temperature to safer levels, while emergency rations provided desperately needed energy. Throughout his hasty self-treatment, Maris watched silently, cradling Alara with practiced ease. The infant had awakened, but remained calm in her aunt's arms, silver-blue eyes curiously studying this new face that resembled her mother's, yet was distinctly different. "What will you do with her?" Kalen asked as he prepared to leave, securing the tracking device to his wrist. "Take her where they cannot find her," Maris replied. "There are others like me, resistance within our society that opposes the genetic manipulation programs. We have safe havens, places beyond the reach of the geneticists. And if I find Lyra? Kalen asked. How will we find you? Maris touched a control on the tracking device, revealing a secondary function. This also contains coordinates for our nearest sanctuary. But understand this, human, if you activate that function, you commit to leaving everything behind. The geneticists will never stop hunting her, or Alara, or anyone who helps them. The weight of the decision resonated through Kalen's being. Leaving everything behind. But what did he have here, really? A self-imposed exile on a frozen rock, haunted by past failures. Lyra and Alara had brought more meaning to his life in months than he had found in years of solitude. I understand, he said simply. Maris nodded, seemingly satisfied. Then go with fortune, Kalen. Find my clutch mate if you can. With a final glance at Alara, memorizing her tiny face, the delicate features that blended Lyra's alien beauty with something uniquely her own, Kalen steeled himself and headed back into the storm. The tracking device proved remarkably effective despite the blizzard. It emitted pulses that grew stronger or weaker depending on his direction, leading him unerringly through the whiteout conditions. Kalen followed it with single-minded focus, pushing his injured body beyond reasonable limits, driven by a fear that eclipsed physical pain. The signal led him away from both the research station and the emergency shelter, toward a region of deep ice crevasses that he had always avoided during his years on Cygnus X2. The terrain became increasingly treacherous, with hidden fissures lying in wait beneath deceptively smooth snow drifts. Twice Kalen nearly fell into these natural traps, saving himself only through desperate lunges for solid ground. As he approached what appeared to be the edge of a massive crevasse, the tracker's signal strengthened dramatically. Lyra was close. Advancing cautiously to the rim, Kalen peered down into darkness that seemed to have no bottom. The howling wind created eerie harmonic resonances as it passed over the opening, like the moans of trapped spirits. Then he saw them, movement on a narrow ice shelf, perhaps 15 meters down. Two figures, Lyra, her back pressed against the ice wall, and one of the alien security personnel, weapon drawn and aimed directly at her. Even from this distance, Kalen could see that Lyra was injured, one arm hanging unnaturally at her side, her normally vibrant crest feathers dulled with pain or cold or both. They appeared to be speaking, the security officer gesturing emphatically with his free hand while keeping the weapon trained on Lyra. She responded with short, defiant movements, her body language conveying what words couldn't at this distance. She would not surrender willingly. Kalen assessed the situation with desperate clarity. He had no weapon, no means of directly confronting the armed alien. The shelf was too far down for him to jump without serious injury. The storm continued to rage, limiting visibility and making any precise movement dangerous. But he had one advantage. The alien didn't know he was there. Moving as silently as the crunching snow would allow, Kalen circled around to a position above and slightly behind the confrontation. There, a column of ice extended from the main wall outward, creating a natural cantilever over the shelf where Lyra and her captor stood. Years of thermal cycling had weakened it, creating visible stress fractures throughout its structure. The plan formed in Kalen's mind with crystalline simplicity. If he could dislodge the ice column, it would fall directly onto the shelf. The timing would need to be perfect. The column had to hit the alien without striking Lyra as well. Using his multi-tools plasma cutter, Kalen began weakening the already compromised ice structure, methodically working through the base where it connected to the main wall. The wind masked the sound of his work, but each passing second increased the risk of discovery. If the alien looked up, or if the ice gave way prematurely, the final cut was the most delicate. Kalen positioned himself carefully, bracing his legs against solid ice, then activated the plasma cutter at maximum output. The ice hissed and crackled as the superheated beam sliced through it, steam rising to mix with the swirling snow. With a sound like a massive glass pane shattering, the ice column broke free. For a terrifying moment, it seemed to hang suspended, defying gravity. Then it plummeted downward, directly toward the shelf below. The security officer sensed the danger too late. He looked up just as tons of ice crashed onto the shelf, striking him directly and carrying his body over the edge into the darkness below. The impact sent vibrations through the entire crevasse wall, dislodging more ice and snow in a cascading reaction. "Lyra!" Kalen shouted, his voice nearly lost in the rumble of secondary collapses. She had thrown herself flat against the wall at the last possible moment, avoiding the direct impact, but now trapped on a rapidly disintegrating shelf. Without hesitation, Kalen secured one end of his emergency cable to an ice anchor driven deep into solid ground, then wrapped the other end around his waist. He slid down into the crevasse, controlling his descent with one hand while the other maintained a death grip on the plasma cutter, using it to melt handholds in the sheer ice wall. He reached Lyra just as the last section of the shelf gave way beneath her feet. Her hand, cold, trembling but still strong, grasped his with desperate strength. For one heart-stopping moment, they both dangled over the abyss, the cable creaking ominously under their combined weight. Then, with strength born of absolute necessity, Kalen pulled them both toward the ice wall, securing a position where they could brace against the vertical surface. Lyra's injured arm hung useless at her side, but her eyes, those remarkable silver eyes, burned with fierce determination. "Alara," she managed to ask, the word forced through pain and exhaustion. "Safe," Kalen assured her. "With Maris. Your clutchmate found us." Relief washed over Lyra's features, her crest feathers momentarily relaxing before another cascade of ice nearby tensed them again. The entire wall was becoming unstable. They needed to climb out immediately. The ascent was a blur of pain, determination, and mutual support. Kalen created handholds with the plasma cutter while Lyra, despite her injury, found natural footholds in the ice with an instinctive grace. They moved in tandem, each compensating for the other's weaknesses, finding a rhythm that transcended their different physiologies. When they finally reached the rim of the crevasse, both collapsed into the snow, gasping for breath in the thin, frigid air. The storm had begun to slacken slightly, the first hint that it might eventually pass. In the brief moments of improved visibility, Kalen saw that Lyra's injury was worse than he had initially feared, a deep wound that extended from shoulder to elbow, likely from the alien weapon. "We need to treat this," he said, already reaching for the remaining medical supplies in his pack. Lyra shook her head urgently, pointing back toward the research station, then making a sweeping gesture that encompassed the sky above. More were coming. They couldn't stay exposed. "The emergency shelter," Kalen agreed. "Maris was headed there with Alara, but she's probably gone by now. Still, it's our best option." As they began the arduous journey back across the ice fields, a new sound cut through the diminishing storm, the high-pitched whine of engines, different from those of the alien craft that had landed at the research station. Looking up, Kalen saw a sleek vessel descending rapidly, its design similar to but distinct from the one he had glimpsed earlier. "Maris?" he asked Lyra. She shook her head, her expression grim. Her crest feathers flattened completely against her scalp, the reaction he now recognized as extreme fear. "We have to run," Kalen said, understanding immediately. "Now!" They fled across the snow-covered terrain, each step a battle against exhaustion and injury. Behind them, the vessel touched down, its landing thrusters melting the snow and ice in a perfect circle. Figures emerged from it. More of the alien security forces, their movements disciplined and purposeful as they spread out in a search pattern. Kalen and Lyra had perhaps a 5-minute head start, but in their current condition, it wouldn't be enough. The emergency shelter was still too far. They needed closer sanctuary, somewhere to hide until the immediate threat passed. "The thermal vents," Kalen suggested desperately. "They're closer, and the residual heat might mask our thermal signatures." Lyra nodded, adjusting their course slightly. They pushed on, each becoming the other's strength when individual reserves faltered. The wound in Kalen's shoulder had reopened, warm blood freezing almost instantly against his skin. Lyra's injury seemed to pain her more with each passing minute, her natural grace giving way to a stumbling gait. The thermal field appeared before them like a mirage, a subtle distortion in the air where heat from deep within Cygnus X-2 rose to create a microclimate amidst the frozen wasteland. Steam vented from narrow fissures in the rocky substrate, immediately crystallizing in the surrounding cold air to create bizarre, ephemeral ice sculptures. They reached the active vent where they had built their snow shelter earlier, now partially collapsed from the ongoing storm. Working together despite their injuries, they quickly rebuilt it enough to provide minimal protection. Inside, the temperature rose to merely uncomfortable rather than immediately life-threatening levels. "They'll have scanning technology," Kalen said, applying the last of his medical supplies to Lyra's wound. "But the thermal anomalies here might confuse them temporarily." Lyra nodded, her silver eyes never leaving his face. She reached out with her uninjured hand and touched his cheek, an achingly gentle gesture despite her exhaustion. Then she leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his in that same meaningful contact they had shared once before. This time, something unexpected happened. As their skin touched, Kalen felt a strange sensation. Not quite sound, not quite image, but information somehow flowing directly from Lyra's mind to his. Fragmentary at first, then coalescing into coherent thought. "Thank you for coming back for me. I couldn't bear the thought of never seeing you again, or watching Alara grow." Kalen pulled back slightly, amazed. "You're in my head." Lyra nodded, a faint smile briefly lighting her features despite their dire circumstances. She touched her temple, then made the connection gesture they had established in their improvised communication system. "Your species is telepathic," Kalen realized. "That's what made Alara so valuable to them, isn't it? She inherited this ability, but wasn't supposed to have it." Lyra pressed her forehead against his again, the connection re-establishing instantly. "Our leaders fear this ability. They've spent generations breeding it out of our species, making it a crime to carry the genetic marker. When Alara developed it spontaneously, they saw it as both threat and opportunity. That's why they hunt us. The intimacy of the mental contact was overwhelming. Kalen felt not just Lyra's thoughts, but echoes of her emotions. Her fear, her exhaustion, but most powerfully, her fierce devotion to Alara and her growing feelings for him. "They can't have you," Kalen said firmly. "Either of you. We'll find a way out of this." As if in direct challenge to his determination, voices became audible outside their shelter, the musical but harsh language of their pursuers. Scanning equipment hummed, its pitch rising and falling as it swept across the thermal field. They were out of time. Lyra's eyes met his, a decision forming between them without words. She touched the crystal she had given him earlier, still clutched in his hand, then made a deliberate gesture toward the ground beneath them. Understanding blossomed in Kalen's mind. "The thermal vent," he whispered. "It connects to a larger system underground." Lyra nodded, already moving to the center of their shelter where the vent's heat was strongest. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for a human adult, but it extended downward into darkness, steam rising from unknown depths. Outside, the voices grew closer. The snow shelter's wall dented inward as someone pressed against it, investigating the anomalous structure amidst the natural terrain. Kalen hesitated just a moment longer. "We don't know what's down there. It could be a dead end, or too hot, or..." Lyra silenced him with a look that transcended language barriers. The message was clear. Whatever waited below, they would face it together. The alternative was capture or death. Decision made, Kalen helped Lyra position herself at the vent's opening. She went first, her more slender body sliding into the narrow passage with relative ease despite her injury. Kalen followed immediately after, barely managing to squeeze his broader shoulders through the constricted entry. The descent was blind, terrifying. The shaft twisted and turned, sometimes opening into wider chambers, sometimes narrowing until passage seemed impossible. The temperature rose steadily, from merely uncomfortable to actively painful. Their clothing, designed for Cygnus X2's frozen surface, now worked against them, trapping heat against their bodies. How far they traveled, neither could say. Time lost meaning in the dark, twisting passages. At some point, they began encountering flowing water. Not the frozen sheets of the surface, but actual liquid, heated from below to create underground streams that had carved these very tunnels over geological time. When they finally emerged into a chamber large enough to stand in, both were drenched in sweat and steam. Bioluminescent organisms covered the walls, casting a pale blue-green light that revealed a network of similar tunnels branching outward. The air was breathable but thick with mineral content, leaving a metallic taste on the tongue. "We made it," Kalen said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. "But where are we?" Lyra couldn't answer verbally, of course, but she approached one of the walls, studying the bioluminescent growth with evident interest. Her crest feathers had relaxed from their fearful flatness, now gently undulating in what Kalen had come to recognize as thoughtfulness or curiosity. She turned back to him, gesturing first upward toward the surface they had fled, then made a sweeping motion that encompassed their current surroundings, followed by the sign they had established for safety. "You think we're safe here?" Kalen interpreted. "That they won't follow us down?" Lyra nodded, then pointed to her temple and made a blocking gesture. Something about this environment, perhaps the mineral content of the rock, or the depth, or some other factor, might interfere with scanning technology. If they couldn't be detected, they couldn't be followed. Kalen wanted to believe it, but knew they couldn't afford complacency. "We should keep moving anyway. Find a more defensible position, or maybe another way to the surface." For hours, they explored the underground network, discovering a complex ecosystem that had evolved in isolation from the frozen world above. The tunnels sometimes narrowed to crawl spaces, sometimes opened into vast chambers filled with strange mineral formations and more of the bioluminescent growth. Underground streams converged and diverged, some hot enough to scald, others merely warm. They followed the more moderate waterways, using them as guides through the maze-like system. Lyra's condition gradually stabilized as they moved deeper. The wound on her arm, treated with the last of Kalen's medical supplies, had stopped bleeding, though it clearly still pained her. His own injury throbbed with each heartbeat, but remained manageable. The greater concern was dehydration. The heat and humidity were taking their toll on both of them. They found a solution in a chamber where a mineral-rich stream cascaded down a series of natural steps, creating pools of decreasing temperature. The coolest, at the bottom of the formation, was just warm to the touch rather than hot. They drank cautiously at first, then more deeply when no immediate adverse effects manifested. "We need to rest," Kalen said, noting how Lyra's movements had become increasingly sluggish. "Just for a few hours. Then we can continue." They found a relatively dry ledge above one of the warm pools, its surface covered with a soft, moss-like growth that provided some cushioning. Their clothing, designed for sub-zero temperatures, had become oppressively hot in this environment. By mutual, unspoken agreement, they removed the outer layers, keeping only the lighter undergarments. As they settled onto the moss-like surface, exhaustion claimed them almost immediately. Lyra curled against Kalen's side, her injured arm carefully positioned, her head finding a natural resting place on his shoulder. Her crest feathers, now relaxed in sleep, tickled his chin with each breath. Kalen remained awake a little longer, listening to the gentle sound of falling water and Lyra's soft, musical breathing. His mind replayed everything that had happened since finding her escape pod in the ice. The birth of Alara, the gradual building of trust, the moments of connection that had slowly healed wounds neither had acknowledged. Through all the danger and uncertainty, one truth had become undeniable. He loved them both, this strange, beautiful alien woman and her remarkable child. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it brought a profound peace. Whatever happened next, whatever challenges still awaited them, he had found something worth fighting for, worth living for. He slept. Dreams came, vivid and intense. Not his usual nightmares of the Helix, Seven disaster, but something different. Images and sensations he had never experienced. A world with 3 moons, its skies painted in purples and golds. Towering crystal structures that caught and amplified light in dazzling patterns. Beings like Lyra, moving with the same natural grace, their crest feathers rippling in complex patterns that conveyed meaning beyond words. When Kalen woke, he wasn't certain how much time had passed. The bioluminescence provided constant light, disconnected from any day/night cycle. Lyra was already awake, sitting at the edge of the ledge, her feet dangling above the warm pool below. She turned as he stirred, and even before she pressed her forehead to his in greeting, he recognized something had changed. The telepathic connection formed instantly this time, clearer and stronger than before. "I showed you my homeworld while you slept," she explained. "It seemed important that you understand where I come from." "It was beautiful," Kalen said sincerely. Asterisk, it was once, before the geneticists gained control, before they decided that certain traits, like telepathy, were dangerous to their ordered society. Those of us born with the ability were corrected as infants, our genetic structure altered to suppress the trait. But they kept samples, studying the phenomenon even as they eradicated it from the population. Asterisk. "And Alara?" Kalen asked. Asterisk, an accident. Or perhaps something more. "I was designed as a vessel. My reproductive system optimized for their experiments, but without the telepathic trait. The genetic material they used should have been clean of it as well. Yet somehow, Alara developed the ability spontaneously. When the prenatal scans detected it, everything changed. I became not a vessel, but a threat." Asterisk. The depth of the violation of Lyra's body, her autonomy, her very genetic identity, filled Kalen with a cold rage. What kind of society treated its own people as mere experimental subjects? What kind of beings could look at the miracle that was Alara and see only a regulatory problem to be eliminated? "Not all are like that," Lyra continued, sensing his thoughts through their connection. Asterisk, Maris and others work against the system, helping those who wish to escape. There are sanctuary worlds where beings like Alara can develop freely. Asterisk. "Then that's where we need to go," Kalen said decisively. "Once we find a way out of here, we'll use the coordinates Maris gave me. We'll find her and Alara, then head for the nearest sanctuary." Lyra's silver eyes studied him intently. Asterisk, "You would leave your world behind? For us?" Asterisk. Kalen didn't hesitate. "This place stopped being my world the moment I found you in that escape pod. My world is wherever you and Alara are now." The surge of emotion that flowed through their telepathic connection was overwhelming. Joy, gratitude, and something deeper, something Kalen recognized because it mirrored his own feelings exactly. Love, complex and powerful, transcending the differences in their species, their origins, their experiences. Lyra leaned forward, pressing not just her forehead, but her entire body against his, their arms encircling each other in an embrace that communicated more than words or even telepathy could convey. For a long moment, they simply held each other, two beings who had found connection in the most unlikely of circumstances. When they finally separated, a new determination filled them both. They gathered their minimal belongings and resumed their exploration of the underground network, moving with renewed purpose. The tunnels continued for kilometers, sometimes climbing upward, sometimes descending deeper into the planet's crust. They passed chambers filled with crystal formations so beautiful they took Kalen's breath away, their structures refracting the bioluminescent light into rainbow patterns across the walls. In other areas, the tunnels narrowed until they had to crawl on hands and knees through claustrophobic passages. Eventually, they began to feel a subtle change in the air, cooler, crisper, with an indefinable freshness that suggested proximity to the surface. Following this sensation, they found themselves in a massive chamber where a shaft of actual daylight pierced the darkness from high above. An exit, Kalen said, hope rising. But it's at least 30 meters up. We'd need climbing equipment. Lyra studied the walls thoughtfully, her gaze tracing the natural protrusions and ledges that might serve as handholds. Through their now almost constant telepathic link, Kalen sensed her assessment. Difficult, but not impossible. They rested for a full day's cycle, gathering strength, treating their injuries as best they could with the limited resources available. They drank deeply from the mineral springs and harvested some of the moss-like growth, which proved to have limited nutritional value but was better than nothing. The climb was as challenging as they had anticipated. Even at full strength, it would have been difficult. In their injured state, it was grueling. They moved slowly, methodically, testing each handhold before trusting it with their weight. Twice, Lyra nearly fell when weakened rock crumbled beneath her grasp, saved only by Kalen's quick reflexes. Once he slipped and slid several meters down the wall before managing to arrest his descent, tearing open his partially healed shoulder wound in the process. But they persevered, their determination fueled by the thought of Alara waiting for them, by the promise of sanctuary, by the future they had both begun to envision together. When they finally reached the opening, they emerged not onto the frozen plains of Cygnus X-2, but into a sheltered valley unlike anything Kalen had seen during his years on the planet. Steep rock walls, warmed by geothermal activity below, had created a microclimate where the snow melted almost as quickly as it fell. Hardy vegetation clung to the more protected areas, not the lush growth of temperate worlds, but still, astonishingly, life on a planet Kalen had always believed to be sterile beyond its deep thermal vents. They stood for a moment, breathless from the climb and from the unexpected beauty of their surroundings. The storm had passed completely, the sky above a clear, deep blue. In the distance, mountains rose like jagged teeth against the horizon. "We need to find out where we are," Kalen said, checking his wrist scanner, which had begun functioning again now that they were above ground. "The tracking device Maris gave me can lead us to the sanctuary coordinates, but first we need to reach a spaceport or at least a settlement with communication capabilities." Lyra nodded, then pointed to herself and made a gesture that encompassed the valley, followed by a sign of recognition or familiarity. "You know this place?" Kalen asked, surprised. She pressed her forehead to his, the telepathic connection forming instantly. Asterisk, not this specific location, but similar formations exist on other worlds. These valleys are often rich in mineral deposits our people value. There may be a mining outpost nearby, or at least a survey marker with communication equipment. Asterisk. They set out across the valley, moving as quickly as their still healing injuries would allow. The terrain was rugged but navigable, the relatively warmer temperatures a welcome change from the brutal cold of the open plains. They found a stream of actual liquid water, a rarity on Cygnus X-2 surface, and followed it, reasoning that any settlement would likely be positioned near such a valuable resource. 3 days later, they crested a ridge and saw it. A small outpost nestled against the valley wall. Too small to be a full mining operation, but large enough to potentially have what they needed. From this distance, Kalen could make out several prefabricated structures, a landing pad, and what appeared to be a communication array. "It looks abandoned," he said, studying the outpost through his scanner's magnification function. No sign of movement or active power signatures. They approached cautiously nonetheless, alert for any indication of recent occupation or security systems. The outpost proved to be exactly what it appeared, a preliminary survey station, established to assess the valley's mineral potential but abandoned once the initial work was complete. Its systems were powered down but intact, the equipment left in place for future expeditions. "This could work," Kalen said, examining the communication array. "If I can restore power, we might be able to contact Maris." The outpost fusion generator was small but functional, designed to operate for years with minimal maintenance. It took Kalen several hours to reactivate it, carefully following startup protocols to avoid damaging the delicate systems. When the lights finally flickered on throughout the facility, both he and Lyra shared a moment of triumph. The communications equipment was standard Colonial Authority technology, familiar to Kalen from his engineering background. He calibrated it to the frequency embedded in the tracking device Maris had given him, then transmitted a simple message. "This is Kalen. We are alive. Send coordinates for rendezvous." For 3 days, they waited anxiously for a response. The outpost provided welcome shelter and resources, clean water, emergency rations, medical supplies that allowed them to properly treat their injuries. They explored the facility thoroughly, finding sleeping quarters, laboratory space, and even recreational areas designed for survey teams that might spend months at a time in isolation. On the morning of the 4th day, the communication array chimed with an incoming transmission. The message was brief, encrypted, and contained only a set of coordinates and a time. Northern continent. Coordinates 67.8921, minus 134.5782. 3 days from now, at local dawn. Examining the planetary maps stored in the Outpost database, Kalen identified the location, a remote, uninhabited region nearly 1,000 kilometers from their current position. "We'll need transportation," he said. The outpost must have had vehicles for exploration. They found what they needed in a maintenance bay at the rear of the facility, a terrain vehicle designed for Cygnus X2's harsh conditions. It was powered down, its batteries drained after years of disuse, but the generator had enough capacity to recharge them. While the vehicle systems came back online, they gathered supplies for the journey: food, water, medical equipment, tools that might prove useful. Despite the urgency, there was a strange domesticity to their preparations, a harmony to their movements as they worked together toward their common goal. The journey north proved less arduous than expected. The terrain vehicle, despite its age, performed admirably across the varied landscape. They traveled primarily at night, when the risk of detection was lowest, navigating by stars and the vehicle's guidance system. During daylight hours, they found shelter in caves, abandoned research outposts similar to the one they had left behind, or natural formations that provided concealment from aerial observation. Throughout the journey, their bond deepened. The telepathic connection between them strengthened with practice, allowing communication that transcended the limitations of spoken language. They shared memories, hopes, fears, Lyra revealing more of her world and culture, Kalen opening up about his life before the Helix 7 disaster, his family on Earth, the career and relationships he had abandoned in his self-imposed exile. As they neared the rendezvous coordinates, anticipation and anxiety grew in equal measure. Would Maris be there as promised? Would Alara be safe? Had their pursuers somehow intercepted the communication and set a trap? They arrived at the designated location hours before dawn, concealing the vehicle in a natural depression and continuing on foot to a vantage point overlooking the rendezvous site. It was a flat, open area surrounded by ice formations that rose like abstract sculptures against the horizon. The perfect place for a spacecraft to land, or for an ambush. Through the night, they watched and waited, alert for any sign of movement. Lyra's superior night vision proved invaluable, allowing her to detect subtle changes in the environment.